Hello, everyone. So, we are near the end of this course. So, this is the tutorial session for the 11th week of the course Animal Physiology offered by Professor Mainak Das on NPTEL. I am Kritika Agarwal. I am a PhD scholar at Center for Ecological Sciences in IIT Bangalore. So, during this week, the major topics that were discussed included respiratory system, how the gaseous exchange happens in the body between blood and the lungs and between blood and the organs. The anatomy and physiology of the blood vessels was discussed in great detail, and the differences between arteries and veins were noted down. And then we were introduced to some terminology and the relationships between these different terms. So, coming up to the respiratory system, so, as you can see in this diagram, we basically have the entry of air or inhalation and exhalation happens through the nose. And in the nasal cavity, we have various obstructions like mucus and hair, which catch the particles in the air. And the nose has a function of humidifying the air and making it come to the temperature of the body. And so it humidifies the air, it warms the air, and then it reaches through the trachea to the lungs. And in lungs, the exchange of gases happens with the blood and the inhaled air. Here is a further diagram to show that in the nose, these are the nostrils, and from here the air enters. Here in the nasal cavity, we have the obstructions for the other particles, which we would like to get rid of, and from here the air moves on to enter into the lungs. Moving on to the lungs, and so here is a labeled diagram of the lungs, and you can see here is the trachea. And it's not just a smooth, straight tract, it is a cartilaginous shape which includes these ringed structures, and they expand as we inhale or as they get filled of air, and they relax when the air is expelled out of the trachea. The trachea basically connects to or branches off into the two bronchi, which then enter the two lungs, the right and the left lung, and then they branch off further into smaller structures. And the smallest structure where the actual exchange of gases happens is called the alveolus. And as you can see here, each alveolus receives a capillary, and they are very closely bound together. And the because of the difference in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and oxygen, an exchange of these two gases happens between the alveolus and the capillary. So these are basically the tiny air sacs at the end of the bronchioles, and they are the locations of gas exchange in the inhaled air to the deoxygenated blood due to the difference in the partial pressure, as I already mentioned. And they are made up of different types of pneumocytes, basically type 1 and type 2, and you can see that there's a difference in their structure. And there is this basal membrane on which everything settles down, and there's this alveolar macrophage which travels along in the alveoli. The blood that comes into this capillary is deoxygenated. That's why it's been highlighted in blue, and the blood that leaves is basically oxygenated, shown in the red. So how does this happen? How does the exchange of gases happen? So there's basically a difference in the partial pressure of gases in the inhaled air and in the partial pressure of gases in the deoxygenated and the oxygenated blood. So when we look at it further, in the inhaled air, basically the partial pressure of oxygen is about 100 millimeters of mercury, and of carbon dioxide it is 40 millimeters of mercury. But in the blood that comes, the deoxygenated blood has a partial pressure of oxygen only 40, and of carbon dioxide is up to 45. So when the blood comes here closer to the alveoli, the oxygen, because of its high partial pressure in the alveolus and low partial pressure in the blood, transfers or diffuses into the blood, and the carbon dioxide diffuses out of the blood because of higher partial pressure in the deoxygenated blood. And finally, the blood that leaves from the lungs has a partial pressure of oxygen of around 100 and carbon dioxide of 40, which is similar to the to that in the inhaled air. So that is how the gaseous exchange happens, basically by normal diffusion. So, since oxygen has a higher concentration inhaled here than in deoxygenated blood, it moves from the lungs to the blood. Conversely, carbon dioxide has a higher concentration in the blood than in the incoming air, and therefore it follows the pressure gradient. It moves from the blood to the air, and the blood then circulating further from the lungs is oxygenated, and that is carried by the pulmonary veins back to the heart. From the heart, this blood gets pumped to the rest of the body. And how the gaseous exchange happens between the blood and the organs, it basically follows the similar structure or the similar pathway. Now we see that the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood, as we saw here, is 100 and partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 40. But the partial pressure of oxygen in the tissues is 40 millimeters of mercury, and that of carbon dioxide is 45 millimeters of mercury. So basically, they follow their own pressure gradients, and oxygen moves from the blood to the tissues, and carbon dioxide moves out of the tissues into the blood by the capillaries. So, how all this oxygen and carbon dioxide is being passed around, or how the blood moves, is through the blood vessels. So, now let's discuss the structure of arteries and veins. In arteries, we have a four layered structure, and as you can see here, the innermost layer is basically called the tunica interna, and it is comprised of the endothelium and the basement membrane on which this endothelium sits. Then, out of this, or along this basement membrane on the outer side, is the internal elastic lamina. Then comes the tunica media, which is made up of smooth muscles. So they're not controlled by the brain; they're just smooth muscles which do not need any control. And then there is the external elastic lamina, and then there's the tunica externa. So you can see here that arteries are very thickly membraned, and they have two elastic membranes, so they can withstand a lot of pressure. So I've written out some pointers here. Basically, arteries are round with very thick walls. It is a four-layered structure that can withstand high amounts of blood pressure. So the aorta that actually comes directly out of the heart, it withstands a very high amount of blood pressure, because when the heart pumps blood, it goes with a great amount of pressure. Endothelium in this arteries is a little rippled. You can see here there are these ripples here. It's rippled when the because the vessel gets constricted and then expands. Tunica media is thick and it is dominated by smooth muscles and these elastic fibers. And tunica externa has mostly collagen and elastic fibers. And this is the lumen, basically where the blood flows. Now that we have discussed arteries, let's look at the vein. In the vein, the endothelium is actually smooth, and you can see the major difference is that the arteries, the membrane is thick. There are four layers, but in the veins, it's very thin. We don't have any elastic membranes. There's the endothelium and the basement membrane that together form the tunica interna or intima. Then there's the tunica media, which is pretty thin as compared to the one that we saw in the arteries, and tunica externa. And there is this presence of these valves that prevent the backflow of blood. So, as I note down, there are no elastic membranes present. So, there are no elastic membranes in the veins as we saw in the arteries. In arteries, there are these two elastic membranes, internal and external elastic lamina. One is present inside the tunica media and one is present outside the tunica media. The endothelium here is smooth, it is not rippled. The walls are present here to prevent the backflow of blood. Tunica media is little thicker than tunica interna and it is dominated by smooth muscles and collagen fibers. Tunica externa has collagen, elastic fibers, and smooth muscles. But you can see that there's not a lot of elastic membrane in this because the veins do not come across a lot of high amount of blood pressure. The blood pressure in the veins is pretty low, so they do not have they do not have to undergo that high amount of blood pressure. Coming next to this diagram of how arteries then become arterioles, which are much thinner, which branch out and then eventually form the capillaries, and the capillaries they come together form venules, and these veins come together and form the veins. As I discussed before, these two external laminae are present in the arteries but they are absent in the veins entirely. And here you can also see the structure of the capillary. The capillary is only has the internal membrane, basically the basement membrane in the endothelial cell, because the exchange of air has to happen. It cannot have a very thick layer around it. And you can see a live image here. So this is how the veins, they're very flaccid. They don't have a structure, a tight structure giving them any structural integrity. But arteries here you can see they're pretty round and they're not like a flaccid oval shape. So arteries are pretty round and there are these four layers you can see here, but the veins are very flaccid compared to the arteries. Moving on to capillaries. So we have three types of capillaries in our body. One of them is continuous, which does not have, which basically has this intercellular clefts. That is between the cells, there are these openings present, but it does not have fenestrations. Fenestrations are technically these openings that you can see here, which are or windows from where the gaseous exchange happens mostly. So they have a continuous basement membrane and they do not have these fenestrations, but they have small intercellular clefts. These are continuous capillaries. Fenestrated capillaries also have a continuous basement membrane, but they also have small fenestrations here, which are like these openings present. And the sinusoidal capillaries, which is the last type, they have large amount of clefts, discontinuous basement membrane, and large fenestrations present in these cells. So these three types, the continuous capillaries, they're found in the kidneys, in the small intestines, and in the endocrine glands mostly. So the three organs that have continuous capillaries are kidneys, small intestine, and endocrine glands. Fenestrated capillaries are seen in the liver, in the spleen, in the areas with bone marrow and lymph nodes, and sinusoidal are found in the nervous system, fat, and muscle tissue. Moving on to arteriosclerosis, this is a disease that happens or a condition that happens because of deposition formed in the endothelial lining of the artery, as you can see in this image. And the arteries, they get thickened and they get tough. They are not as elastic as before. They lose their elasticity and they become very stiff. And because of the increased amount of blood flow and pressure on the walls, it might lead to an aneurysm. An aneurysm is like this. It basically, the morphology of the arteries change, and there is this extension that might form from the arteries, which can actually lead to many complications later. Moving on to the terminologies that were discussed during this week, basically we talked about blood flow, and blood flow is actually the volume of blood that is flowing per unit time through a vessel or a group of vessels. So either you can be talking about a single vessel or you can be talking about the group of vessels, but the volume of blood that is flowing per unit time is the blood flow. Total blood flow is also called the cardiac output, basically whatever the heart outputs. That's the total blood flow. Blood pressure is the pressure or the hydrostatic pressure in the arterial system that pushes the blood through to the capillary bed. So if the arteries experience a lot of blood pressure because the blood is pumped with a lot of pressure from the heart. So that hydrostatic pressure which is experienced by the arterial system is called the blood pressure. And the circulatory pressure is the pressure difference between the base of the ascending aorta or the aorta that is coming out of the uh, left ventricle and the entrance of the right atrium. So it's the pressure difference between the aorta and the entrance of the right atrium. That's the circulatory pressure. Hydrostatic pressure is pressure which is exerted by any liquid in response to an applied force. So the applied force here is the beating of the heart, and the liquid here is the blood. So the pressure exerted by blood on the arterial walls because of the pumping of the heart is the hydrostatic pressure we're talking about. Peripheral resistance is basically the resistance of the arterial system, and it is affected by various factors such as the vascular resistance. Vascular resistance means the resistance due to friction within blood vessels, primarily between the vessel wall and the blood. So it is the friction which is experienced by the flow of blood because of the vessel wall. It increases with the increase in the length of the vessel and by decreasing the diameter of the vessel. So if somebody has arteriosclerosis, they will have higher vascular resistance because the diameter is decreased because of the deposition in the endothelium. Viscosity is also known as the thickness of the liquid. It is the resistance to flow due to the interaction of various particles in the liquid. Here we're talking about blood, and the various particles in blood are the WBCs, RBCs, platelets, and the microparticles such as the proteins. So the resistance to the flow of the blood due to the interaction between these different particles is called viscosity. And turbulence is the resistance which is caused because of an irregular movement of the blood at high flow rates. For example, if the aneurysm is formed and the blood is flowing with high pressure, because of that irregular movement of the blood, there might be eddies that get formed in the blood flow in the arterial system. So that is turbulence. Coming on to basic resistance, it is the force that basically opposes the movement of blood flow. That is basic resistance. Any force that opposes the movement of flow is basic resistance. Total peripheral resistance is the resistance of the entire cardiovascular system, not just of the arterial system. And venous pressure is the hydrostatic pressure in the veins. So blood pressure was the hydrostatic pressure in the arterial system, venous pressure is the hydrostatic pressure in the veins of the system. Coming to the different relationships that are seen, so flow or the blood flow is proportional to pressure gradient. So flow F is proportional to pressure gradient, which is P, and then flow is inversely proportional to resistance. So F is proportional to 1 by R. So you can say that flow is proportional to delta pressure, which is pressure gradient, divided by resistance. Flow is proportional to blood pressure by peripheral resistance as well. So if the blood pressure is high, the flow will be high because, of course, if there's more force, then the blood will flow faster. But if the resistance is higher, the blood will flow slower. That is why it is blood pressure by peripheral resistance. It's inversely proportional to the resistance. Resistance is inversely proportional to the vessel radius to the power 4. So if the radius of the vessel is increased, the resistance goes down, but if the radius is decreased, the resistance goes up. And the mean arterial pressure, also known as MAP, is actually the sum of diastolic pressure and pulse pressure. leads to the mean arterial pressure. Coming to the question answer session of today, the first question is, which of the following is not a part of the respiratory systems? And there are four options given: trachea, larynx, pharynx, and bronchi. So it might be clear to you already that trachea, pharynx, and bronchi are a part of the respiratory system. So larynx is the correct answer because there's nothing called larynx in the human body. The trachea is mainly made up of what of the following? Is it made up of cartilage, ligament, skeletal muscle, or bone? Because it can expand, it can undergo expansion. That is why it should be obvious to all of you that trachea is actually made up of cartilage, because bones cannot actually expand, and skeletal muscle and ligaments are also not something that make up the trachea. Dash is also called the windpipe, and it branches into the dash in the lungs. So this is a pretty straightforward question. Trachea is called the is windpipe, and it branches into bronchi in the lungs. I already discussed it while discussing the diagram of the lungs. Dash carry blood from the heart to the body, and dash carry blood from the body to the heart. So the answer is arteries and veins. Pretty straightforward. Coming on to the cardiovascular system, it is what? Is it a closed loop system, open loop system, A and B based on the temperature of the body, or none of the above? The correct answer is a closed loop system because there is no loss of blood. Basically, the heart starts pumping the blood, goes to the lungs, gets oxygenated, comes back to the heart, and then pumps to the rest of the body, and it comes back to the heart. It's a closed loop. There is nowhere where the blood goes out of this loop. Which of the following is not a layer or is not a component of an artery? Tunica insula, tunica media, externa, and basement membrane. It might be clear to you that the answer is actually tunica insula because it's either called tunica intima or tunica interna. There is nothing called a tunica insula. Dehydration is dash mostly leads to the increase in dash arteries with age. So degradation of what leads to an increase in what? So degradation of elastin leads to an increase of stiffness in the arteries with age. At any given point, arteries hold what amount of blood compared to veins? They actually hold less blood than veins at any given time. The veins are dash than than the arteries. It should be obvious. They are less elastic and they are thinner than the arteries. Where does the gaseous exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide primarily occur in the lungs? So, what is the part where the gaseous exchange occurs? We discussed it in the diagram. It's the alveoli. How is oxygen primarily transported in the blood? It's bound to the hemoglobin in the red blood cells. Everybody should know this. How do veins differ from arteries in their structure? How are veins and arteries different? Are veins thicker and they carry blood under high pressure, or are veins thinner and they carry blood under lower pressure? Do they have no smooth muscle layer and do they contain no blood cells? The correct answer is they are thinner and they carry blood under low pressure. What happens to carbon dioxide in tissues where cellular respiration occurs? So, what happens to carbon dioxide in tissues where cellular respiration is occurring? It basically diffuses into the blood and is transported back to the lungs. What structural feature is characteristic of arteries but not veins? Which of these following structural features are found in the arteries but not in the veins? It's actually thick elastic walls. What prevents blood from flowing backwards in the veins? You would already know this probably. We've studied this in high school and we also discussed this. Valves in the veins, they prevent the backflow of blood. Which blood vessels are responsible for the direct exchange of gases, nutrients, and waste products between blood and tissues? Is it arteries, veins, capillaries, or lymph vessels? The correct answer is capillaries because that is where gaseous exchange happens. Which of the following best describes the function of capillaries? Does it pump the blood from heart to the lungs? Does it transport the blood at high pressure? Does it facilitate the exchange of oxygen, nutrients, and waste products? Or does it store blood during rest? The correct answer is facilitates the exchange of oxygen, nutrients, and waste products. Thank you. This was all about today. And I will upload this video on YouTube for your reference.